My name is Michael Amar Calfee. My middle name goes back to the second president of the Republic of Texas. I am a fourth generation native Texan, and my name was handed down to me from several members of my family. My grandmother was the latest before me to have the name. I am not a historian with letters after my name. I am just someone who is curious about the history of Texas you don't often hear about. I'm not trying to tell you everything there is to know about a place or an event. I'm just hoping you will get a taste and then yearn to visit these places yourself to learn more. In 1867, the United States Army started establishing or reestablishing forts in Texas after the Civil War. One of those forts was Fort Griffin. It took place right up this hill. Go ahead and pan up this hill if you would, Judy. Kind of show that hill. All right, right on top of that hill, which became known as Government Hill, is Fort Griffin. It's just right over that rise. But here is where the town of Fort Griffin, or sometimes called the Flat, was established. Almost instantly from the day they established this fort on the hill, this town was born. Judy, kind of pan that way if you will, and kind of show those buildings if you can. Down that road are some of the remains of the Flat. Now the Flat was a town that experienced, bring it back this way, yeah, that experienced two big booms in its life. It was a boom town twice. One of those times was due to the fort being here and the buffalo hide trade. From here, buffalo hunters would go out to the plains and would slaughter buffaloes by the hundreds of thousands. A buffalo hunter could easily kill 100 buffaloes a day, and he would contract with skinners who would go with him, and they'd bring them back here to the Flat, or sometimes known as Hide Town, and they would grade them, set them up, and take them then off to the east, loaded in wagons. And they would do this. Now this town was good size. It was 1,000 people at times would live, and then other people would move through here, transients and other type of stuff. That's a gigantic town for the size of, say, the Texas frontier. First off, like I said, it was a buffalo hide town. They had streets and buildings, countless streets and buildings here, and beside each building, which was probably someone who bought and sold and shipped buffalo hides, they would be grading these hides. They would have piles of buffalo hides stacked in lots in this town. The smell must have been great. At one time, the Flat had over 20 saloons and 20 cat houses and lots of other buildings. There was a big store down here that supplied everybody in the town, as well as a branch of that store. The Conrad and Rusk store was actually up on the post, which we'll see the remains of that in a little bit. But the Flat was just an amazing, amazing place in Texas history. They like to talk about how Dodge City was such an evil place, and how all the casinos and bars and bordellos and things like that they had there. But Dodge City had lawmen like the Mastersons and the Earps there to try to keep the peace. The Flat had no such thing. They would elect maybe a sheriff, but very often in these frontier towns like this, the person they would elect for sheriff or to enforce law and order was somebody who had already been on the other side of law and order, and maybe he was a gunslinger or somebody like that. He was already a tough guy, and so they figured that what they needed was a tough guy, And these guys would work both sides of the law while they were in office. But the first half of this town's life in the 19th century was that of buffalo hides. At a time when the soldier up on Fort Griffin might get paid $13 a month salary, a buffalo hide would sell for $2 to $3 a hide. That's amazing. That's an amazing price. Now you're going to see some vehicles going on here because today, believe it or not, the foundation for Friends of Fort Griffin are getting ready for a great big soiree, or a gala, if you will, that's going to be taking place here at the flat. That's kind of exciting, and you'll see some of that stuff going on. But this town, well, let's talk about it just a little bit. In 1867, the fort was founded. Almost immediately, the fort was seen as a place where settlers and I said 1867, I hope, that settlers could come, people moving west headed out the California gold rush, and people could set up here and make money off of the fort being here. Sometimes make money off the fort and the government itself, but other times make money off the people who could be here with some kind of security. The buffalo hide trade was just spectacular. Lots of people came here and hunted buffalo. Wyatt Earp came here one time as a job in like 67 or the early 70s and worked as a buffalo hunter. He hired some guys to be skinners and came here and did this sort of thing. And they would and it was, like I said, it was spectacular. The theft of buffalo hides that weren't yours was a serious crime. Speaking of crimes, one of the things that happened was for 10 or 15 years or more, man, the rule of law here was vigilantism. Oh my gosh, the trees were decorated with horse thieves and cattle rustlers on a regular basis by one vigilante brigade called the Tin Hat Brigade that would go and who knows what, as soon as somebody was accused of this sort of thing. They would catch them and they would string them up. And we'll talk more about that later. All right, we're going to move to a little bit different location, a little bit different shot. But I'll post links to these historical markers with this video, later on. Okay, let's move. All right, here's another shot of some of the buildings that were at the flat. You can see them behind me. The first building, I'll move a little bit. The first building that you see there is John Shaughnessy's Saloon. It was called the Beehive. If you ever watch the movie Wyatt Earp with Kevin Costner, you will see exactly where Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday met for the very first time. They were introduced by John Shaughnessy at the Beehive, and that is the actual location of the Beehive Saloon, but every board that you see there is rebuilt of the saloon. It's sitting on the original foundation. That's the spot, but it's where that conversation took place, but it's not the original building. Right next to it is a very interesting building of stone. I hope you can zoom in on that. It's right behind that road closed through traffic. There's a historical marker in front of it, but I'm not going to go over there because too many people might have a problem with that today. Let's talk about the flat. It was considered unbelievably lawless, unbelievably sinful in a lot of ways. That had the boomtown experience twice. Not long after 1867, it became the place for buffalo hunters and buffalo skinners to sell buffalo hides, and the town was just packed full of rotting buffalo skins that would be loaded onto Teamster wagon trains and taken back east. As I mentioned earlier, a buffalo hide was $2 or $3 a piece at a time when the soldier up on Government Hill was getting paid $13 a month. The incentive to steal buffalo hides and sell them on the black market was high. When a buffalo hide came in, they had people who would look at these hides, look at the quality of them, grade them, and mark them with maybe a number or a brand on the inside in an effort to try to keep them from being stolen. You did not want to be found with a buffalo hide that had somebody else's mark on it. That was a problem. And like I said, it was fairly lawless vigilante justice. It was pretty bad. In 1874, it got so bad that the commander of the post decided to impose martial law and took over the policing of the town. It was causing problems with his troops. It was just so lawless. It was causing problems with settlers and residents and things like that. So he imposed martial law. This was in place for 1874 until finally later in 1874, Shackelford County in Albany was able to petition the state to make this Shackelford County, is what it was. It wasn't an incorporated county until then. Once they did that, they could have a sheriff. The state would help pay for a sheriff. Well, naturally, what they did was they hired a couple of strong-arm gunslinger kind of guys that had already been in trouble with the law who knows how many times, and they were John Larn and then Deputy John Selman. Okay, John Selman has a history that goes way beyond Fort Griffin. I'll talk about that in a minute. But John Larn, man, he worked both sides of the law like you wouldn't believe. At one point he entered into an agreement with the post to provide 3 steers a day for food for the post, which was kind of a lucrative contract that he got. And he had a ranch, and he had cattle just like everybody around here did. But people started noticing how their herds kept getting smaller, and John Larn's herd never did. And what he was doing was he was stealing cattle from various other herds around, taking 3 cattle at a time here and there, and selling them to the army. Boy, that certainly boosted his profit margin, I'd say. He got in all kinds of trouble. When he couldn't just easily sneak some cows away in the middle of the night, he would go pretty far afield with his gang and would at gunpoint rustle up cattle from other ranchers. And John Selman probably was one of his partners in this endeavor. During one of these raids, a rancher actually got a shot off and wounded John Larn and recognized him. And in the process, by now, John Larn's not sheriff anymore. He was replaced with somebody else who said, elect me because I am not an outlaw. And so Larn was, or somebody was wounded in this thievery, in this rustling, and that ended up causing a warrant to be issued for his arrest. The new sheriff found John Larn, arrested him, and fearful that his gang would try to boost him out of jail, break him out of jail, he took him to the county jail or the city jail here in the Flat and handcuffed, shackled, and chained him to the floor so he couldn't get loose no matter what. Well, I mentioned the Tin Hat Vigilante Brigade earlier. They were tired of rustlers and things of this nature, so they decided they were just going to go to the jail, get John Larn, take him out, and hang him, and be done with it. To heck with having him go all the way to Albany to the county seat and stand trial, because he'd been, missing out on being prosecuted so much, they decided to just end it. Well, they got there, and there he was chained to the floor, and they couldn't get him out to take him out and hang him. So they just shot him right there on the floor of the jail. Holy cow. Isn't that something? Well, like I said, the vigilantes in the mid-70s, any accusation of cattle rustling or horse thieving was usually met with a hanging. One guy, one time they took him out and they hung him from a tree. It was like Christmas decorations, people hanging from the trees around here. They would hang, and on at least one occasion, they took somebody, hung him from a tree, and then at the base of the tree, they would leave a shovel and a pickaxe in case some relative wanted to come along and bury him. And they would just leave his gruesome remains there until somebody did. That was the kind of town this was. Now, like I said, Dodge City was terrible, but this town was worse because for the longest time, until about 1876, there was really no law here. The law that they got, John Larn and John Selman, like I said, were as criminal as anybody, and his efforts to try to catch and punish rustlers was really more them trying to eliminate rustler competition. That's how bad of a lawless town this was. This was the Flat. Now the Flat can be seen from up on Government Hill, and we'll do a shot of that now. As you can see, you can look down on these buildings and you can see them from their lookout, which is right close to the powder magazine up on the hill. But this was the Flat, one of the most lawless towns probably on the Texas frontier. Now, that was just kind of the first half of its history. The second half of the Flat's history, well, the buffalo kind of played out. Then what do? Well, at that time, now cattle drives are really popular. The train had come to Texas in the 50s, and Kansas, and got a little bit closer as far as cattle drives, and the Chisholm Trail, and there was like 5 or 6 big trails that went through Texas. The Goodnight Loving Trail, which started up around Fort Belknap, but what happened was, from southwest Texas, cattle drives or cattle drivers would funnel to about Albany and the Flat. And they would meet up here, and they would use the stores and outfitters in the Flat to get the provisions and everything they needed. They would use the Brazos River as a watering hole to water down the animals really good before taking off. And what happened here became known as the Great Western Cattle Trail. Now, everybody knows about the Goodnight Loving Trail or even the Chisholm Trail. This trail shipped over 100,000, well over 100,000 cattle from here to Dodge City. And when you watch an old Western and they're talking about the cattle drivers coming up from Texas to Dodge City, I don't care if it's old Gunsmoke or something about Wyatt Earp or whatever else, and the cattle drivers coming to town and what a mess it is, those cattle drivers are coming from here, coming from the Fort Griffin area. This was sometimes called the Fort Griffin Dodge Trail, but it became more known as the Great Western Cattle Drive Trail, something of that nature. There's a marker over there. We got a picture of it. We'll get it over later. But that's what this was. And for years, that was the economy of this town, was that cattle drive. Now, around 1877, Wyatt Earp got a deputy marshal contract from a judge up in Dodge to go look for Dave Rudabaugh. Okay, and they heard that he had come down here to Fort Griffin. Now, Fort Griffin was one of the many towns, frontier towns, that was on the gamblers circuit. All right, gamblers like Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp even would go from town to town, spend a few weeks there, pick a bunch of pigeons for their money, and they would, until they got run out of town, they'd go to the next one, the next town. Well, Wyatt Earp heard that Dave Rudabaugh, who was just an awful outlaw, who rode with lots of different people, and his story, Google him and read his story about what happened to him and how he got, I think he got arrested one time by Wild Bill Hickok but escaped, and it's just a crazy, crazy story than what happened to him ultimately in Mexico. Fascinating story. But Wyatt Earp came here looking for him. And John Shaughnessy of the Beehive Saloon was an old friend of Wyatt Earp's. They'd known each other for 10 years. And he went there and said, you know, it's a great scene in the Wyatt Earp movie with Kevin Costner. How he came in, asked him if he knew Rudabaugh, and he said, yes. Do you know where he might have gone? He said, he was here, but no, we don't know. I know somebody who doesn't like Dave Rudabaugh and would be more than happy to tell you. And Wyatt Earp was ultimately introduced to Doc Holliday. Now, there are stories that Doc Holliday and Rudabaugh did do some poker playing together and kind of helped each other with their skills of shooting and playing poker and stuff like that. But they fell out of friendship, which they never really had much of one. And the fact that Doc Holliday didn't like Dave Rudabaugh is quite famous and really well expressed in that scene in that movie. But he was introduced, Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp were introduced right there in Shaughnessy's Beehive Cafe here at Fort Griffin and the Flats. An amazing piece of history. But that's not all. I mean, a lot of people were gaming men, like gamblers is what they like to call themselves, gaming men. And they would come to places like this to play poker and bet on fights and do all kinds of things, you know, play lots of different games that were really well slanted towards the house, to be quite honest. Faro was one of them. Wyatt Earp liked to deal Faro, and if you know anything about Faro, you know it's a real simple game that any simpleton can play, and it's just unbelievably favored to the dealer of the house. But these people would come to Fort Griffin. They called it Fort Griffin, but really it was the Flat, or the town of Fort Griffin, or the town of Griffin. And they would play poker, do whatever. Bat Masterson visited here. His brother Jim visited here. Pat Garrett, who is famous for killing Billy the Kid, visited here. And of course, Wyatt Earp was here on more than one occasion. Another interesting person about this area and who had dealings here at the Flat was John Selman. Now, John Selman got in trouble for rustling, got in all kinds of trouble. He was off and on being a police officer, a constable, and things like that. Well, after John Larn was killed on the jail floor, he kind of got out of town, but he was John Larn Sr. John Larn Jr. fled to El Paso and became a police officer there. All right, well, why is that part of the story? Well, from Bonham, Texas, a guy in the early 19th century emerged by the name of John Wesley Hardin. John Wesley Hardin liked to kill people. He did it as sport. He did it to be tough. He did it because he could. And he did it for money. If you needed somebody killed, John Wesley Hardin will kill anybody that he thought needed killing. And with the right amount of money, you could convince him somebody needed killing. And he just had no bones about it. He'd walk right up to him and shoot him in the head in cold blood. Very common thing. We know he murdered at least 27 people. There are thoughts that he probably killed more like 43 people in his life. Finally, he is prosecuted for the murder of one person and receives 24 years in prison in Wall's unit at Huntsville. He serves only about 17 years of that 24-year sentence, but he is a model prisoner. He studies law. He becomes someone who works. His father named him John Wesley after the Methodist John Wesley, because his dad was a preacher and expected him to go to seminary. Well, he ultimately became very involved in the prison church, and he was paroled or pardoned after only 17 years of that 24-year sentence. And he came out, now educated, takes the bar exam, and decides he's going to be a lawyer. John Wesley Hardin, one of the worst murderers in the history of the state. And he goes to El Paso, where he kind of gets in trouble a little bit. And John Selman's son, John Selman Jr., is a police officer there. And John Wesley Hardin and John Selman Jr. get in a fight over some cards or something, and John Wesley Hardin pistol whips John Selman Jr. a little bit. Well, it just so happens that John Selman Sr. is in El Paso at the time, and being the kind of rough, horrible person he is, he waits until John Wesley Hardin, who has paid his debt to society, is now trying to be a lawyer, but at the same time, he is already in trouble a couple of times. John Selman decides, well, enough of this. I think John Selman realized that the way you go down in history is to kill somebody famous. Pat Garrett went down in history as the guy who shot Billy the Kid. Okay? So I think John Selman was looking for an excuse. Well, you pistol whip your son. Somebody does that to it, kind of makes you mad. I think he was looking for a chance to do something famous. And so he simply walked up behind John Wesley Hardin in a restaurant bar and shot him in the back of the head and killed him instantly, and claimed self-defense. It's all true story. And of course, John Selman, though, started out right here in Shackelford County as a police officer, as a rustler, as an outlaw here at the Flat. Can you believe that? And somehow the Flat went from being just a horrible place, and then all these famous people, and then somehow being tied in with John Wesley Hardin. This was an incredibly important point in time and space for outlaws, for the development of the West, for the Native Americans, and we're going to talk about that more when we talk about the fort, and for you name it. An amazing, amazing place, the Flat. Reading about it, now I got to tell you, I am not a historian. I'm not an expert on any of this stuff. I'm a tourist, just like you are, and I'm bringing you along with me. I'm a little bit of a tour guide, but I'm not an expert. And I've just barely scratched the surface of what you can find on the internet about Fort Griffin and the Flat. It's an amazing place. Just amazing historically. I don't know if I've been in Europe, I've been in places where the Nazis were, I've been in all kinds of historical places, and never did I feel a sense of history as I have here. This is just crazy. And in a little bit, we're going to go talk about the Post, and we're going to see their Fort Griffin Frontier Day celebration and see what that's all about. Thanks for coming along with me to the Flat. Hey, as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed that video. Remember now, these YouTube channel videos, we live or die based on you pushing that like button. So please take the time, push the like. I would really like that. And you know what? Let's see if I can get up to 1,000 likes. That'd be cool. And stay tuned. You never know where we're going to be next.